In the marble palaces of Rome, where incense and perfume once masked the stench of blood, whispers told of an emperor whose desires knew no limits. His name was Tiberius, heir of Augustus, ruler of an empire stretching across the known world. And yet history remembers him not as a wise sovereign, but as Tiberius the insane. Among the corridors of his villa on Capri, hidden away from the Senate and the people, he built a world of shadows. Ancient historians write of grotesque practices that shocked even Rome, a city long accustomed to excess. Here, children barely past infancy were trained as fishes, taught to swim between the emperor's legs and satisfy him in ways too disturbing for most records to fully describe. Elsewhere, noble boys and girls were forced into roles of degradation, their cries echoing through chambers where marble statues seemed to watch silently, forever frozen in horror. These were not mere rumors. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, chroniclers of Rome, left chilling accounts, their words coated with disgust. To them, Tiberius had turned his exile on Capri into a theater of perversion, where power became the ultimate aphrodisiac and cruelty fused with pleasure. This was not just decadence. It was a descent into something darker, a twisting of childhood, a corruption of innocence, a grotesque experiment in domination that would forever stain the name of Rome. The empire, outwardly strong and glorious, was rotting from within, and at its heart stood an emperor whose private sins make Caligula himself seem tame. These are the most horrific sexual practices of Tiberius the Insane, acts so vile they were whispered about in Rome for generations and still have the power to chill the blood nearly 2,000 years later. Before we plunge deeper into this forbidden history, take a moment to join our growing community of truth seekers. Hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the hidden stories history tried to bury. Share in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because together, across time and distance, we're unearthing the secrets that connect us all. The more we speak of these shadows, the less power they hold. Now, let us return to Rome's darkest emperor and uncover the nightmare behind the mask of imperial glory. Long before history branded him, insane Tiberius Claudius Nero was a boy caught in the ruthless machinery of Roman politics. Born in 42 BCE to the aristocratic Clodii family, he grew up in a Rome still trembling from civil wars. His childhood was not marked by warmth or affection, but by power struggles, betrayals, and the constant reminder that he was a pawn in games larger than himself. His mother, Livia Drusilla, was ambitious and calculating. She divorced Tiberius's father while pregnant with his younger brother Drusus, in order to marry Octavian, the man who would become Emperor Augustus. From that moment, Tiberius was thrust into the orbit of imperial power, raised not as a free boy, but as a political instrument. He showed early signs of ability. A talented soldier, he led campaigns in Germania and along the Danube, earning respect from legions who admired his discipline and tactical brilliance. To the world, Tiberius appeared as the perfect Roman general, stoic, restrained, loyal to Augustus. But behind his rigid exterior, bitterness grew. Augustus never truly trusted Tiberius. The emperor's eyes were fixed on his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, whom he hoped would carry his legacy. Tiberius was tolerated, used when convenient, but never fully embraced as heir. He was even forced to marry Julia, Augustus's daughter, a woman infamous for her scandalous affairs. Their marriage was loveless and humiliating, pushing Tiberius further into resentment and isolation. In 6 BCE, humiliated and weary, Tiberius did something extraordinary for a Roman prince. He exiled himself. Retreating to Rhodes, he lived far from the capital, nursing his wounds and watching from a distance as Augustus groomed others for power. Some historians suggest this period hardened him, filling him with paranoia and a sense of betrayal that never left his soul. When Augustus's chosen heirs died prematurely, fate twisted back toward Tiberius. Reluctantly, Augustus named him successor. By 14 CE, when the great Augustus breathed his last, Tiberius became emperor of Rome. Outwardly, he was cautious, reserved, even reluctant. The Senate praised him for his modesty, for pretending to resist power. Yet behind his mask of restraint, something dark stirred. His early years as emperor were not marked by wild cruelty, but by suspicion. he distrusted everyone: the Senate, the generals, even his own family. His reliance on the ruthless Praetorian prefect Sejanus only deepened this atmosphere of fear. Executions became common. Treason trials filled Rome with paranoia. But the most disturbing transformation came later, when Tiberius abandoned the capital altogether. In 26 CE, weary of politics and disgusted by Rome's endless flattery, he withdrew to the island of Capri. There, perched on cliffs above the turquoise waters, he built a series of villas, magnificent yet isolated, guarded from prying eyes. Capri became his private kingdom, far from the Senate's judgment, far from the public's gaze. It was here that the whispers began. Capri was no simple retreat. It became a laboratory of depravity, a theater where Tiberius indulged fantasies too grotesque for the imperial palace. Ancient authors speak of Caprine delights, perversions, and cruelties enacted against the most vulnerable. What could transform a disciplined general into a monster of legend? Historians speculate. Perhaps it was the years of humiliation under Augustus, the bitterness of being unwanted, the loveless marriages and betrayals. Perhaps it was the paranoia of rule, the crushing loneliness of absolute power. Or perhaps, deep within Tiberius, there had always been a darkness waiting for the right conditions to emerge. By the time he withdrew to Capri, he was an old man, but not a harmless one. His body aged, his desires twisted. Instead of finding peace, he gave himself to obsession. Children were brought from noble families under the guise of education, only to become pawns in his grotesque games. Servants whispered of orgies, of tortures, of unspeakable acts that defied Rome's already loose moral codes. The Senate, far away in Rome, pretended not to see. Who would dare confront the emperor? Who would challenge the man who commanded the legions? Silence covered Capri like a shroud, while the island became synonymous with nightmares. To understand Tiberius's horrors, one must remember the world he lived in. Rome was no innocent society. Gladiators died for sport. Slaves were property. Sexual domination was considered an expression of power. Yet even in this world of brutality, the stories of Tiberius stood out. Even jaded Romans whispered that what he did went too far, and so his name passed into infamy. Not merely as a suspicious ruler, not merely as a recluse, but as the emperor who turned paradise into a prison of flesh and blood. Capri became the backdrop for stories that would echo for centuries, tales of the most horrific sexual practices of Tiberius the Insane. The stage is now set. The emperor has withdrawn from Rome, the island fortress is sealed, and the whispers are growing louder. What happened inside those villas? What acts could so horrify the ancient chroniclers that even their words tremble with disgust? Prepare yourself, for the descent into darkness is only beginning. When Tiberius retreated to Capri, Rome thought its emperor had chosen peace. To the Senate, he wrote polite letters, pretending he still cared for state affairs. To the people, he left festivals and coinage to maintain the illusion of order. But behind the cliffs of Capri, hidden from view, the emperor descended into an abyss of obsession. The villas he built were breathtaking. Marble colonnades overlooked the sea. Frescoes of gods and lovers covered the walls. Pools shimmered in candlelight. Yet within these splendid chambers unfolded scenes that shocked even a society drenched in cruelty. For Tiberius, beauty was merely a stage set for degradation. Ancient authors record that he filled Capri with children, some scarcely old enough to speak. Taken from noble families under the pretense of education, they were trained to become objects of pleasure. Suetonius, writing a century later, tells of the minnows, young boys instructed to swim between the emperor's thighs and perform unspeakable acts in the water. For Tiberius, the baths were no longer places of cleansing but theaters of corruption. Others were forced to role-play grotesque scenes. Young girls were dressed as nymphs, their innocence twisted into parody. Boys were clothed as satyrs, compelled to enact obscene rituals while the emperor looked on with cold satisfaction. In these games, childhood was erased, replaced by fear and humiliation. And Tiberius did not stop there. He surrounded himself with an entourage of perverse advisors, men who shared his appetite for domination. Together they devised spectacles of cruelty, choreographed rituals that blurred the line between sex and torture. Victims were paraded like actors, their tears dismissed as part of the performance. The island became infamous. Rome whispered of Caprine delights, a euphemism for acts so vile they could scarcely be put into words. Even hardened senators trembled at the rumors. What exactly was happening behind those walls? Were the stories exaggerated, or were they fragments of a truth too terrible to be told openly? One tale spoke of statues carved into obscene positions, their marble cold against the bodies of children forced to imitate them. Another whispered of animals brought into the chambers, their presence turning the spectacles into grotesque parodies of mythological scenes. The line between ritual and nightmare blurred. Tiberius himself seemed transformed. Once the disciplined general, he now pursued excess with an old man's desperation. Age did not cool his desires, it sharpened them. His face, wrinkled and grim, leaned over the bodies of the young, feeding on their terror. To him, their cries were not pleas for mercy, but music to fuel his fantasies. Why did he do it? Historians speculate endlessly. Perhaps it was revenge on a society that had humiliated him. Perhaps it was the paranoia of rule, twisting into cruelty. Perhaps it was simple indulgence. An old man, insulated from consequences, exploring depths no one dared restrain. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Capri became a realm where innocence went to die. Tacitus hints at the scale of this corruption, describing Capri as a retreat of shame. Dio paints Tiberius as a man consumed by lust and cruelty, a tyrant whose retreat revealed his true nature. To later generations, the emperor's name became synonymous with debauchery, his island a symbol of hidden perversions. Yet amid the silence of Capri, victims endured. Imagine the fear of a boy torn from his family, told he was to serve the emperor. Imagine the despair of a girl dressed as a goddess, only to be reduced to a plaything. Their voices are lost to history, but their suffering lingers in the stories that survived. Power protected Tiberius. Who could accuse the emperor? Who would dare to testify against him? To speak was to risk death, to resist was to vanish. And so, silence reigned. The only record of their agony comes from historians who piece together whispers, stories too stubborn to be buried. But Tiberius was not content with corruption alone. His cruelty escalated into brutality. Children who displeased him were beaten, their bodies discarded like broken toys. Servants who resisted were executed, their deaths staged as warnings. The island became a graveyard of innocence, where fear hung heavier than the sea air. The transformation was complete. The man who once marched with legions, who once endured exile with stoic restraint, was gone. In his place stood a tyrant who reveled in degradation. Capri was not a sanctuary, it was a throne of nightmares, and this was only the beginning. The whispers of Rome had not yet captured the full depth of what Tiberius unleashed. Behind the villa doors, the emperor's appetites grew darker, his cruelty sharper, until even his closest allies feared the shadow of his presence. The descent into madness was far from over. As the years on Capri dragged on, Tiberius's world became more detached from reality. The emperor no longer governed Rome, he ruled over fear. Capri, with its high cliffs and turbulent waters, seemed designed for isolation. Once you were brought to the island, escape was almost impossible. It was a gilded cage, and within its walls, Tiberius played the role of both god and tormentor. At first, the horrors seemed confined to twisted spectacles, children humiliated, bodies forced into grotesque mimicries of art and myth. But soon the emperor's obsession demanded escalation. Pleasure turned to punishment. Fear became a tool of arousal. Pain was blended with desire until the two were indistinguishable. Ancient writers whisper of chambers where victims were suspended in nets, dangling like prey while courtiers laughed at their terror. Others were forced to endure beatings under the guise of discipline, only to be summoned again for further humiliation. Those who resisted or broke under the strain were discarded. Capri had no shortage of replacements. Rome's provinces were vast, and families eager for favor delivered their children as offerings, never knowing the fate that awaited them. The cruelty was not limited to the innocent. Senators who displeased Tiberius were summoned to Capri under false pretenses. Some never returned. Suetonius records that executions became entertainment. Victims were hurled from the island's cliffs, their screams lost in the crashing waves. To Tiberius, death was a spectacle, one final humiliation for those who failed to satisfy his will. Rumors spread of bodies found broken on the rocks below, their faces still twisted in terror. The sea itself seemed cursed, swallowing the evidence of the emperor's wrath. Locals whispered that the waters around Capri were haunted, that the souls of the dead cried out in the wind. Paranoia consumed Tiberius. Every shadow seemed a threat, every whisper a conspiracy. He demanded loyalty tests, forcing servants to betray one another, ensuring that trust was impossible. The island became a web of suspicion where survival depended on silence and obedience. Even his closest advisors feared his moods. Sejanus, once his trusted prefect, was executed in a purge of paranoia that reached back to Rome. The line between politics and perversion blurred. Treason trials and sexual spectacles fed the same hunger, domination. Tiberius did not merely want pleasure, he wanted proof of his absolute power. To strip away dignity, to erase resistance, to watch as men and women submitted not only to his body, but to his authority. This was the true fuel of his obsessions. Even the architecture of Capri reflected this madness. Suetonius speaks of gardens filled with obscene statues, carved into positions that mocked the victims forced to imitate them. Pools were designed not for bathing, but for degradation. Every corner of the villa carried the imprint of obsession. To the people of Rome, the emperor's absence grew more sinister with each passing year. Letters from Capri arrived, filled with polite formalities, but behind them lurked a silence heavy with rumor. Senators whispered of what was happening, but no one dared speak openly. How could they accuse a man who held the legions? How could they condemn the emperor without condemning themselves for complicity? And so the empire remained quiet. Coins bore Tiberius's image. Official decrees carried his name. Outwardly, Rome appeared strong, but beneath the marble, rot spread. Capri was not just a private indulgence. It was a symbol of how power corrupts when unchecked. For the victims, the days blended into torment. Some were so young they could not even understand what was happening, their cries dismissed as part of the performance. Others grew hardened, their innocence shattered, their eyes empty from repeated humiliation. They were ghosts in living bodies, moving through rituals they could not escape. The cruelty of Capri was not an isolated aberration, it was the natural consequence of absolute power without accountability. Rome, a society already drenched in violence, had created an emperor who embodied its darkest impulses. Tiberius was not a monster born in isolation, he was the product of empire, wealth, and ambition twisted into nightmare. Yet even monsters grow weary. As Tiberius aged, his paranoia deepened. He withdrew further, rarely appearing in public even on the island. He relied on intermediaries to carry out his punishments, issuing orders that were followed without question. His body weakened, but his imagination grew more cruel. The more fragile he became, the more desperately he clung to control, as if the humiliation of others could preserve his fading strength. Still, the whispers spread. Stories of the Caprine delights traveled across the empire, carried by servants who escaped, by soldiers who saw too much, by senators who returned with haunted eyes. Rome became obsessed with the rumors, half in disbelief, half in morbid fascination. Was it truly possible that the emperor of the world's greatest empire was spending his days surrounded by children, statues, and orgies of humiliation? The answer, whispered in taverns and marketplaces, was yes, and worse than you think. Capri had become the stage for something unprecedented. Rome had always known decadence, banquets of vomit, gladiators slaughtered for sport, nobles indulging in orgies. But this was different. This was systematic, ritualized corruption. Tiberius's practices were not accidents of indulgence, but carefully designed humiliations, repeated endlessly like rites of a twisted religion. The emperor had become both priest and executioner in his private cult of perversion, and as the years passed, the boundaries of cruelty stretched further still. The descent was not yet complete. The horrors of Capri had more depths to reveal, and Rome itself was about to feel the weight of the emperor's paranoia. The longer Tiberius remained on Capri, the more his name became synonymous with dread. Even among Romans, accustomed to excess, Jaded by bloodsport and hardened by centuries of conquest, whispers of his private life inspired shudders. The island had ceased to be a retreat. It had become a nightmare that spread its shadow across the empire. The old emperor, once a soldier of discipline, now surrounded himself with courtiers who catered to every twisted impulse. They scoured Rome and the provinces for victims, the beautiful, the young, the vulnerable. Some were deceived with promises of education or favor. Others were handed over willingly by ambitious families eager for imperial attention. For the parents, it was a political gamble. For the children, it was a sentence of horror. Inside the villas, the spectacles reached new levels of grotesque precision. Accounts describe how entire chambers were arranged like theaters of ritual. Walls lined with obscene frescoes, floors polished to reflect the humiliations enacted above them. Children were placed on elaborate contraptions, forced to mimic gods and heroes from mythology, Venus, Apollo, Ganymede, while their dignity was stripped away before the emperor's gaze. Suetonius writes with disgust of the bedchambers of shame, where statues depicted acts so explicit that the victims were compelled to imitate them, often under threat of violence. The emperor, sitting in silence, demanded not just obedience but performance. To him, pleasure was not raw indulgence. It was the spectacle of submission, the erasure of individuality. But indulgence alone could not satisfy him. Fear became part of the ritual. Some victims were forced to drink until they collapsed, their bodies mocked and degraded. Others were suspended by ropes, left dangling while courtiers laughed at their humiliation. Punishment and desire fused into a grotesque theater, each act pushing the boundaries of human suffering. Tiberius's paranoia only deepened the cruelty. He feared betrayal at every turn. Servants who whispered were executed, their bodies thrown into the sea. Guards who failed to meet his expectations were whipped and mutilated. Even his companions, those who had once shared in the Caprian delights, lived in fear, for a single misstep could turn the emperor's pleasure into rage. The cliffs of Capri bore silent witness. Ancient sources tell us that victims were sometimes hurled into the waves below, their final screams echoing across the island. Fishermen spoke of broken bodies washing ashore, the sea carrying its grim tribute. Locals began to fear the waters themselves, whispering that they were cursed by the souls of the dead. And yet, in Rome, silence prevailed. Senators received polite letters from Capri, written in the emperor's hand, filled with dry instructions about law and governance. These letters maintained the illusion of normalcy, while behind them lay a world of perversion. The Senate dared not confront him. Who among them could risk such wrath? The rumors grew darker still. Some spoke of animals brought into the chambers, their presence twisting the spectacles into grotesque parodies of mythological scenes. Others claimed that priests of foreign cults were summoned to invent new rituals of degradation, blending superstition with cruelty. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories reflected one truth: Capri had become a place where boundaries no longer existed. Tiberius himself seemed to revel in this reputation. Suetonius claims that he mocked morality, boasting of acts that even hardened Romans considered shameful. To the emperor, shame was not a deterrent, it was the very essence of power. By breaking the taboos of Rome, he proved that he was above law, above tradition, above humanity itself. The victims, meanwhile, faded into silence. Children who survived grew into hollow adults, their lives marked by trauma too deep for words. Others never escaped the island at all. Their names are lost, their voices erased, their suffering remembered only in the disgusted writings of historians who struggled to capture the depth of what they had heard. And still, Capri endured. By the time Tiberius reached his 70s, the island had become less a palace and more a fortress of fear. Guards patrolled the cliffs. Servants whispered of hidden chambers no one dared enter. The emperor himself, frail and wrinkled, lurked in the shadows of his villa, still hungering for the spectacles that had defined his exile. To Rome, he was a ghost emperor. He had not entered the capital for over a decade, yet his shadow loomed over the Senate. Treason trials continued in his absence, fueled by his paranoia. Senators executed their rivals in his name, feeding the culture of fear that he had perfected on Capri. Thus, the empire itself became an extension of the island. Just as children on Capri submitted to his grotesque rituals, so too did Rome submit to his paranoia. Power and fear became indistinguishable, both in the villa and in the Senate. The legacy of Tiberius was already sealed. Even before his death, he was spoken of as a tyrant beyond redemption, a ruler whose personal sins had eclipsed his military victories. Historians would later debate the accuracy of every rumor. Were all the tales true, or did his enemies exaggerate them? Yet the consistency of the accounts, the disgust in every chronicler's tone, leaves little doubt that some part of the horror was real. And even if only fragments of the rumors were true, they were enough. Enough to stain the name of Tiberius forever. Enough to make Capri a synonym for depravity. Enough to ensure that, 2,000 years later, his reign still chills the imagination. But the story does not end in whispers, for every descent has its breaking point. Tiberius's grotesque theater of domination could not last forever. Age, paranoia, and the growing hatred of Rome would soon bring the emperor to his downfall. The climax of this nightmare, the moment when even power could no longer protect him, was drawing near. By the time Tiberius crossed into his 77th year, the empire felt as if it were ruled by a phantom. He had not entered Rome since 26 CE. The city knew him only through edicts and rumors, a distant presence whose breath still fogged every mirror of power. But Capri, that amphitheater of humiliation and fear, had begun to tighten around him as a trap tightens around its maker. Age weakened the body that once commanded legions. Desire, once an intoxicant, curdled into irritability and suspicion. The emperor's world shrank to corridors of dread and to-do lists of punishment. He drifted from villa to villa, a gray specter in layered robes, his sandals whispering over mosaic floors that had seen too much. He spoke in monosyllables. He stared with clouded eyes. He signed orders with a trembling hand. The courtiers who had reflected his appetites now watched him in silence, gauging moods, marking the tremors along his jaw, listening for the thin crack in his voice that signaled a killing mood. A glance from the emperor could still end a life. A pause in his dictation could doom a household. But the pauses grew longer. The glances lost focus. The invisible current of terror that had once hummed through Capri flickered, as if the island itself felt the emperor's power slip a little each day. Once he had a man thrown from the cliffs for a minor insolence, so the story goes, and afterward asked, with absent curiosity, how long the fall had taken. "Longer than your anger," a guard murmured under his breath. The emperor did not hear. Others did. Parables began passing between servants like contraband. Tales of a tyrant whose cruelty had outlived his strength, whose appetite had outlived his body, whose dominance was now impersonated by those who wished to inherit it. Sejanus, the iron hand who once enforced Tiberius's paranoia, was already dust-strangled in Rome years earlier when the emperor turned on him. The purge that followed Sejanus's execution had been vast, a delirium of denunciations that stretched across families and provinces, and its echoes still rattled the capital. But another figure had risen from those echoes, Naevius Sutorius Macro, the new Praetorian prefect. Where Sejanus had dominated the emperor, Macro cultivated him, agreeing, soothing, obeying. He sent reports the old man could bear to read, he promised order without questions. And quietly, methodically, he began to build a future without Tiberius. That future wore a youthful, luminous mask: Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, Caligula, the darling of the crowds, son of the adored General Germanicus, nephew to Tiberius, through adoption and dynastic calculation. Caligula had spent time on Capri, learning the emperor's silences, rehearsing the art of vanishing into harmlessness. He flattered when necessary. He kept his face smooth and his voice mild. He watched power up close and learned how to survive it. If Capri had been a school in humiliation for the innocent, it had also been a conservatory of performance for the ambitious. Caligula graduated with honors. In the winter of 36-37 CE, Tiberius left Capri for the mainland, traveling to the Bay of Naples to Misenum, the naval base, where fleets waited and admirals flirted with storms. He stayed in the villa of Lucullus, that connoisseur of luxury whose name had become a byword for excess. The irony was too neat for historians to resist: the emperor who turned pleasure into punishment, ending his days in the house built for pleasure itself. But if the setting was sumptuous, the tenant was a ruin. Tiberius coughed, shivered, then sweltered, his skin papery, his hands mottled. He slept poorly. He woke with orders for executions and forgot them by afternoon, only to remember at night and issue them twice. Courtiers learned to repeat his words back to him, to reassure him that what he had commanded had already been done, whether or not it had. The machinery of terror kept turning, but its engines sputtered. One morning, the emperor failed to rise. Panic moved through the villa like a draft under a door. Physicians gathered, feeling for the pulse at his wrist, then at his neck. Some said it fluttered. Some said it had stopped. In the chamber's hush, the question that mattered most in Rome hung unsaid. Is he dead? For in that moment, the future of the empire could be rewritten by a whisper. What happened next became a legend, stitched from fear and ambition. One version held that Tiberius's breathing simply failed, and Caligula and Macro stepped into the vacuum of silence as if it were a throne room. Another, darker and more cherished by later writers, claimed that the emperor revived after being declared dead, opened his eyes, and asked for food, only to be smothered with blankets by those who could not afford his resurrection. In this telling, Macro kept guard at the door while the old man struggled beneath the weight, and Caligula stood by, all soft features and calculating calm, waiting for the contest between lungs and linen to end. The empire's secret changed hands, not with a trumpet but with an exhalation cut short. Whether the smothering is true or slander, the outcome is certain. On March 16, 37 CE, Tiberius died at Misenum. He died not on Capri, but under the gaze of men who had measured his power and decided to outlive it. Death, which he had dealt so lavishly, arrived with humiliating efficiency. No cliff, no spectacle, no carefully staged terror. Just the ancient end that had chained emperors and beggars alike since the first sunrise on the Palatine. Rome received the news with a sigh that sounded like both relief and hunger. The Senate convened, faces composed into public grief, private calculations ticking behind their eyes. Tiberius had left a will that split the empire between Caligula and his grandson Gemellus, a boy too young to carry a dagger, let alone a world. The Senate politely unstitched that inheritance. Caligula was hailed princeps, the first citizen, with Gemellus reduced to a name within a document, soon to be reduced further. Macro saluted the new master of the Praetorians. The city erupted in applause that felt suspiciously like waking from a nightmare. But the dead are not so easily dismissed. Tiberius's coffin moved toward Rome through towns that inspected it, as one inspects a rumor made flesh. Benedictions were brief. Prayers were perfunctory. The people wanted a festival, not a funeral. Yet in the basilicas and temples, priests intoned the old formulas, as if the incantations could bleach the stains from an era. On the day of the funeral, the rites unfolded with meticulous grandeur. The wax masks of ancestors, the eulogies promising that the emperor's defects had been overcounted by malice, and that his virtues, military skill, restraint in taxation, steadiness in foreign policy, would prevail in memory. Few believed it. Memory is not audited, it is haunted. For those who had lived under the shadow of Capri, the haunting could not be banished by ceremony. The victims, those who survived, carried their private funerals inside their bodies. The names of the dead thrown from cliffs did not appear on tablets. The children ferried to the island as alumni of the emperor's education were not recalled in processions. No law in the Senate returned their time. No coinage struck their faces. The official record of Tiberius's reign listed years, consuls, budgets, borders. The unofficial record, scrawled in rumor and shiver, listed something else: silences, erasures, wounds. Thus the irony of the downfall. The end of Tiberius did not come from revolt or assassination in the Forum. It came from the arithmetic of age and the bravery of opportunists. Power that had seemed godlike dissolved into a bureaucratic transition. A will read, a name proclaimed, a guard commander nodding. The dread that had kept Rome compliant shrank in an afternoon to a court intrigue solved by a signature and possibly a blanket. Tyranny's spells are mighty until breath fails. And what of Capri? After Tiberius's death, it remained beautiful blue sea, steep cliffs, jasmine on the wind, as if nature refused complicity. The villas still stood, their frescoes defiant, their pools reflecting the sky that had watched so much. Servants went on scrubbing floors, lighting lamps, repairing roofs. Visitors came to admire views. The island absorbed its story the way marble absorbs footsteps, slowly, permanently. Later generations would point at those cliffs and tell their children, there, an emperor taught the world how absolute power corrodes not only the realm, but the soul that wields it. Caligula, stepping into his inheritance, promised something like dawn. He scattered coins and pardons, he kissed statues, he wept in public. He gave the crowds what they craved, a theater of charm. For a while, Rome believed it had been delivered. The logic felt comforting. If tyranny dies, the nightmare ends. But nightmares have sequels, and Tiberius had been a tutor of more than one art. The island that taught humiliation could also teach performance, and the pupil had paid attention. In the ledger of history, the column labeled downfall often looks clean, a date, a diagnosis, a successor. But the true reckoning lies elsewhere, in the interiors Tiberius never inspected, the minds of those who lived under him. There, the emperor lived on, a set of reflexes and flinches, a calculus of obedience learned in terror. Capri's deepest export was not scandal. It was a psychology that taught the strong that law was a costume and the weak that silence was a shield. So ends the reign of Tiberius, not with the thunder of rebellion, but with the soft dullness of breath failing in a bed, attended by men who understood that empire is a theater, where the curtains are hauled by hands you never see. The tyrant's body cooled. The courtiers bowed to a new actor. The audience cheered, then looked for the next show. In that exchange of masks and ovations, the truest tragedy sharpened into focus. Rome had survived, yes, but at the cost of learning to live with anything. And yet, amid the ritual of forgetting that follows every tyrant's funeral, one stubborn truth remained. Power can command statues, fleets, praetorians, and senators, but it cannot command innocence to heal. That deficit is the real sentence of history, and it cannot be appealed. The curtains fall here on the emperor's life. What remains is the verdict, a reckoning not in courts, but in memory. It is to that memory, and to the lessons it writes in the margins of every age, that our story now turns. The death of Tiberius should have been the end of a nightmare. For Rome, it was the end of an old man's rule, the removal of a figure whose very name had come to symbolize secrecy, suspicion, and grotesque indulgence. Yet history rarely offers clean endings. Tiberius's legacy did not vanish with his last breath. It seeped into the empire like a toxin that could not be drained. To some historians, he was still the disciplined general who secured Rome's frontiers, the reluctant ruler who initially resisted power, the administrator who left the treasury full. But those accomplishments were smothered beneath the weight of Capri. When later generations spoke of Tiberius, they did not recall balanced budgets or cautious diplomacy. They recalled the whispers of children torn from their families, of bodies flung from cliffs, of villas where innocence was shredded beneath marble ceilings. His reign became a cautionary tale about the dangers of solitude, secrecy, and absolute power. The human cost is impossible to measure. The names of his victims have been lost, erased by silence and fear, but their absence still speaks. They were sons and daughters, slaves and nobles, boys and girls who carried the scars of degradation until death. For every official decree signed in Rome, there was a private scream on Capri. For every polished statue that survived the centuries, there was a body broken and discarded, unmarked in history's pages. Their stories are shadows, but shadows long enough to darken the memory of an emperor. Rome learned briefly that unchecked power breeds not majesty, but monstrosity. Yet the lesson was fragile. After Tiberius came Caligula, who would write his own infamy in the blood of the empire. The pattern was set: emperors who ruled like gods, citizens who bowed like captives, history that trembled with alternating flashes of glory and horror. Capri had not only destroyed lives, it had trained Rome itself to endure cruelty with a shrug. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling legacy of all. Not that one man could descend into depravity, but that an empire could tolerate it. Senators knew, generals suspected, families whispered, and still the machinery of state turned. Bread was distributed, games were held, coins bore the emperor's face. Life went on, even as terror ruled an island and its echoes reached the capital. Silence was the empire's greatest accomplice. For us, centuries later, the tale still resonates because it is more than Roman scandal. It is human warning. Every age produces figures who mistake power for divinity, who treat lives as objects, who silence opposition until cruelty becomes routine. Tiberius's story forces us to ask how much suffering can hide behind wealth, ceremony, and power before a society admits what it has become. To study him is to be haunted, but also to be sharpened. It reminds us that history is not only emperors and battles, but also children whose names we will never know, voices that were never recorded, victims whose pain was real, though their faces are gone. They were not characters in a grotesque drama. They were human beings, erased by the whims of one man. So when we speak of Tiberius the Insane, we do more than retell scandal. We give shape to the silence. We hold up a mirror to power and ask who pays the price when cruelty is disguised as order. We remind ourselves that empires fall, reputations fade, but suffering leaves traces that no amount of marble can conceal. The island of Capri still gleams beneath the sun, its cliffs kissed by turquoise seas, its villas admired by tourists. Beauty endures, as if mocking the horrors once hidden there. Yet beneath the jasmine and the stone, the air carries a memory. It whispers of an emperor who turned paradise into prison, who traded dignity for domination, who proved that even the mightiest rulers are still men, and that men, when unrestrained, can become monsters. This is the legacy of Tiberius, not the coins, not the campaigns, not the decrees. It is the silence of victims, the complicity of a senate, and the eternal warning that power without accountability leads to horrors that echo through time. May his story remain as more than entertainment. May it remain as a caution, a scar, and a shadow across history. For to forget is to invite repetition, and to remember is to honor those whose cries were swallowed by the cliffs of Capri, but whose truth still chills the blood nearly 2,000 years later.